Welcome to today's podcast episode of The Trust Doctor, Restoring Trust and Enriching Significant Relationships. And today I have a certifiable genius as our guest. So you do not have to worry about being the smartest person listening to this podcast, because this man is going to just set your world on fire. But before we go any further, make sure you like, comment, share, and subscribe to this podcast. So our guest today is a true visionary and a true thought leader. His research focuses on why good people make and often repeat bad decisions and how you can avoid doing this. And we all have a laundry list of people that we know need this information. So Dr. Alan Barnard is the CEO of, what is the name of this company here? He's the CEO of Gold Rat Research Labs, which he co-founded with Dr. Elliot Goldratt. And he also is a creator of the theory of constraints and the author of a book called The Goal. And I'm going to have Dr. Allen share all of this with you. And if I were to spend the time sharing with you all of his awards, we would be here until tomorrow. So suffice it to say that Dr. Alan Barnard is truly one of the smartest people you will ever meet. He is also one of the kindest and the most humblest person you ever met. So put on your seatbelt, because Dr. Alan Barnard is about to take us for a ride. Welcome, and thank you so much for for being willing to share your wisdom with us today.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation, and really looking forward to this discussion.
Great. Okay, so tell us what the theory of constraint is, but say it for people that aren't half as smart as you, so that someone like myself can understand it, because I've heard you explain it before and I'm like, it is hard to keep up. So for the average lady and gentleman, share with us what that is.
So if you think about trying to analyze a system or try to manage a system or improve a system, one way of doing that is you try to analyze and improve and manage each of the parts of the system. So whether you're dealing with a company, a for-profit company or for-purpose company, it's made up of many parts, and you can try to analyze and improve and manage each of the parts. But unfortunately, that doesn't give you the best possible performance. So is there an alternative way? And theory of constraints provides a very simple solution to that problem. It basically says that if you can identify what the constraint is of a system, the part that you don't have enough of to meet the goal that you've set for that organization or company.
So hang on one second. So it's the constraint is the part you don't have enough of, as opposed to what's holding you back?
Yes. So it's a slightly different definition, and it's important to differentiate. So if you set yourself a goal for your company, a for-profit goal or for-purpose goal, right, to impact 10 million people or to make $10 million, that's your goal. That immediately dictates what resources you're going to need and what work you have to do to provide the products or services to meet that goal, right? Mm. Now, any of those resources that you don't have enough of to meet the goal is a constraint. So if you don't have enough demand for your product or service to meet your goal, that is your constraint. You might have enough demand, but you don't have enough capacity to deliver the product or service. That becomes your constraint. Or you might not have enough supply or enough cash. So what theory of constraints says, it's kind of like the analogy of a weakest link in a chain, right? If you want to strengthen the chain, find the weakest link and strengthen that. Because by strengthening the weakest link, improving the constraint helps you to improve the whole system. So it's kind of like a hack. It's how do I find this one thing? One way of finding that one thing is by looking for the constraint. and then focusing all your attention and limited resources on improving that part until the constraint moves. And that is what theory of constraints is. It gives you a systematic way of improving any system. It says, define your goal, right? If you haven't done that, that should be your one thing. What is your goal? Then to say, identify the constraint. What don't you have enough of to meet that goal? Is it demand or capacity or supply or cash? Then step 2 says, how do I better exploit that constraint and not waste it? How do I get more from it? So if it is demand, it might mean, okay, what market share do you have? I have 5%. Okay, there's 95% that's available, right? What are those conditions that if you could satisfy them, would get customers, existing customers, to be willing to pay more, buy more frequently, the type of thing that Jay Abraham talks about. Whereas if it's an internal capacity constraint, say your sales team, you just don't have enough salespeople. Do the same thing. Decide how to better exploit and not waste them. How much time are they wasting, traveling, spending in meetings? How can we get more out of them? That's what step 2 is all about, is using what you've got better and then lifting up your performance. And step 3 says subordinate everything to that decision. Any policy or process that you have inside of your organization that's in conflict with the decision how to better exploit it. So you might have an internal policy that says no new hires. Our profit margins are a little bit under pressure. We're not going to hire more people. But what if your constraint was salespeople? And by just hiring one more salesperson, you can increase the sales for the whole company by 20%. Mm-hmm. And the cost will only go up by 2%. That's an example of step 3 of the focusing steps of theory of constraints, is subordinate everything to that decision. You have to change that rule to be aligned with where the constraint is. If that doesn't give you enough to get to the goal, you go to step 4 that says elevate the constraint. Now go and get more. Hire more salespeople, add more products, go into new markets. And then step 5 says, don't let inertia become the constraint. You want to continuously improve. Go back to step 1. Where's the next constraint? Where is it going to move to?
Okay, so give us a real life example of how you're applying the theory of constraint to help a company grow.
So I've recently worked with a Fortune 500 company. They are in a fortunate position at the moment where they can sell whatever they produce, right? Mm-hmm. So if you think about that, as soon as I tell you that information, they can sell whatever they can produce. You know that their constraint is not in the market. Their constraint is either internal, they have a capacity problem, or they don't have enough supply. So something that they need from the outside, either raw materials or components or whatever, or it could be cash. Mm-hmm. So then that was the next question I asked them is, do you have enough capacity to meet the demand? They said, no, we don't. We have enough supply, we have enough cash, but we don't have enough capacity. And then it's okay. Internal, where is your bottleneck? Internal in operations, right? And they gave me this one area that they are using to develop this product that they have. That's where the bottleneck is. You say, okay, great. Now we know where your constraint is. Anything more we can get, if we can increase that resource by 20%, you'll be able to produce 20% more, and your whole revenues will go up by 20%, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. right? And that will have a huge impact on your bottom line. So then it's applying that to decide how to better exploit that constraint and not waste it. So we look for cases where that resource was starved or blocked or working on things that it shouldn't be working on because we want to stop doing that, or working on bad quality stuff. Every time we can correct one of those mistakes, it lifts up its performance. And normally the first thing to do is to just stop that resource doing things it shouldn't be doing, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. What we call overproduction. And by the way, for the listeners or viewers, most likely, if you run a small business, you are the constraint, right? Your limited attention is the constraint.
Right. So how do you solve for that if you are a small business owner?
Yeah, so the first thing that you want to do, and probably most good coaches will tell you that, is write down all the things that's currently demanding your attention. and see which one of those things you should stop immediately because it's not helping you achieve your goal. And the remaining things on the list is what can you outsource? What can you delegate, right? So that you're only focusing on those few things, and then you'll see immediately your productivity increases, and as a result, your business growth will increase. So that's kind of two extreme examples. There's one where you can apply to a Fortune 500 company, the other one where you can apply to a single person company, but the principle is the same. At any point in time, there's only one weakest link. There's only one resource that is your constraint. Now, it could be that sometimes you make your goal so ambitious that you don't have enough of anything, right? You don't have enough customers, you don't have enough capacity, you don't have enough cash, you don't have enough supply. And the advice is a little bit counterintuitive, is to reduce your goal to the level where only one thing becomes a constraint, because that allows you then to focus on just that one thing. As a summary of what fear of constraints is, you mentioned that I co-founded the company with Dr. Eli Goldratt. He was once asked, how would you summarize fear of constraints? And he said, I can do it with just one word: focus. But focus doesn't just mean knowing what to do. Much more importantly, it means knowing what not to do.
Sure.
Right. And for you to be able to assess that, knowing what not to do means what parts of my system is good enough, right? That's a hard thing for entrepreneurs to understand. There's a level of good enough. Like, okay, so you're going to invest $50,000 on designing a new website. Is that the constraint, right, to profitable growth? Well, you can
probably not
test it quite simply. But you can test it if you wanted to. Invest the $50,000 and see if your sales and profitability goes up. If it didn't, you know that you improved the part that wasn't the weakest link, that wasn't the constraint. So better to ask yourself that question, as a thought experiment first. Is this really my constraint? The fact that I can improve it is not important. I can improve every part. It's figuring out what I have to improve to get more of the goals that are important for me.
Right. So focus on that, like let the one thing be the one thing. All right. Yes. So here's a question for you. As a person that's a relationship expert, right, in businesses and personal relationships, and this is a podcast on trust and relationships in business, right?
Yes.
What happens? What do you do when the bottleneck is the relationship, or is the person, or the teams aren't playing nice in the sandbox, which is what I do a lot of, or the co-founders aren't getting along, or the CEO and the COO are no longer aligned? What happens when you're working with those types of issues that you can't put your finger on, and what do you do? So
I would say the first thing is, we try to differentiate between a challenge or problem versus a constraint. They're not the same thing. So as I mentioned, a constraint is something, it's a scarce resource that I don't have enough of. Now, there's three scarce resources when it comes to human beings. Most people, if you ask them, what don't you have enough of to achieve your goal? They'll tell you, I don't have enough time, I don't have enough money, I don't have enough knowledge or experience. But those are not really scarce resources. The scarcest resources we have is, number one, is attention, right? It's the things that demand your attention will always exceed your available attention.
So attention not meaning your time, but attention meaning a focus? Is that?
Yeah, it's almost like attention is focused time. I'd like to call it the time that you have every day to make meaningful progress towards the goals that are important to you.
Okay, I got it. Yeah.
Right? So if you think about that,
differentiator, as opposed to put your attention to anything that will move the needle.
Right, and think about this as how much attention do you have available today? Because there's a lot of stuff that we go through in automatic mode, right? And most people will tell you it's probably just an hour or two every day.
A lot of noise.
Lots of noise where I can actually sit down and focus my attention on the things that really, really matter. So that's your first personal constraint, is attention. The second one is kind of motivation, is that's also a resource that we have that is in limited supply. I have to fill up my bucket of energy or motivation, by being around things that, doing things and being with people that actually support me. Yeah. And close that bottom tap out of my bucket, the things and people that drain it. So that's also a scarce resource that I have to manage and allocate it very wisely. But the third one that to me was very interesting is that it turns out that trust is also a constraint. We have very limited trust.
Well, trust is an accelerator in a company.
Right, but it is also a scarce resource. And the reason how we know that is you have to allocate trust, right? Anything I have to decide to what and to whom to allocate.
Oh, allocate. I don't understand.
Right. Sorry, my accent.
Where do you place your trust?
Right. And it's often, if you think about our default mode is not to trust because we're trying to...
It's a non-trusting world.
So the two mistakes that we make when it comes to the allocation of trust is, firstly, we trust people that we shouldn't. Mm-hmm. That's pretty bad.
So that's when smart people make bad decisions.
Right. We trust people that we shouldn't. You get into a relationship, business or romantic relationship, and there was a bunch of red flags, but you were in honeymoon phase, you ignore them. And now you're stuck, right? But it turns out that that's not the worst mistake that we can make. The worst mistake we can make is not trusting somebody that we should have.
It's trustworthy, correct.
Right. And that's essentially, if you're an organization, you have to trust the people that you're with. If you don't trust them, basically what the mind does is it constantly are looking for evidence to support your belief. Correct. So when you distrust everybody around you, you're constantly gathering evidence to support that belief.
That they're not trustworthy. Exactly.
Exactly. And you'll get into a vicious cycle that's impossible to escape from. So that's my advice, is to view trust also as a constraint, to realize you have to be very careful how you allocate trust to what and to whom, but that the biggest mistake is not trusting somebody that you shouldn't, because the worst case is you lose some time. The biggest mistake is not trusting people that you should have, not trusting things that you should have, that takes away opportunity.
Okay, so, which is so true. So my understanding, and this comes from Stephen M. R. Covey's book, his latest book, Trust and Inspire, I think, or maybe it was the book before that, right? So the people, what he talks about is smart trust, right? And I work with this all the time. He at least gave me the framework on how to speak about it, right?
Yes.
So when you have smart trust, it's based on two things, especially in an organization: competency and character. Oftentimes the competency, everybody's pretty clear on. That guy can do the job, stay away from that person, he can't do the job. But it's the character piece that gets you into trouble, right? So in your theory of constraint, and I know I'm asking to play in my field, but we are dealing with human behavior. How do you account? So we also talk about the older generations thought that trust should be earned. The younger generation thinks trust should be given, which is what you're saying. Trust until somebody proves otherwise, they shouldn't be trusted. But smart trust, right? You don't give somebody that can't add up the CFO position because you trust them or like them, right? And you might also have somebody that's brilliant, but their character's a little sketchy. I don't want them being my CFO either. Right. So like a very basic example. So how do you, in the theory of constraint, or maybe there's a better way you can speak about it, address that, knowing that trust, because I think trust is at the heart of every successful business relationship. How does that work into your theory of constraint if you don't have enough of it? If you don't realize you giving your trust to the wrong person, even when other people tell you, what are you, crazy? Or they won't, because there's an issue of trust in the organization, and then people will not speak truth to power.
Right.
Is that an easy question?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it starts with what's your starting assumption, right? is that most people think that the starting assumption is that trust should be earned, and that it's better, you'll be more protected by not trusting and then letting people earn their trust.
And that's old school. That's old.
It's old school, but it's also flawed. And part of the reason is what I just explained, is how our human mind works, is it's constantly gathering evidence for what we believe. Mm-hmm. So if you start off with a belief that the other side cannot be trusted, you will constantly look for evidence to support that belief. Right. And guess what will happen if you don't find the evidence? You don't go, oh my goodness, I was wrong all the time. You'll look for more evidence. You'll think that, oh, they're hiding it really well. Or you start raising, right? Or you start changing your threshold, your standard, right? Suddenly, them just telling you a white lie, why they were late for the meeting is now evidence that they cannot be trusted. They're a liar, right? And now you feel much better. So clearly, that's not a great, we understand why people do it, but it's not a good starting assumption. Like you said, a better starting assumption is, let me trust you until you prove me wrong.
Right.
Right? But that means that I need to be careful of those red flags. Mm-hmm. So I need to write down what are those things that I should look for and get fast feedback on it, right? If I get into a relationship, either business relationship or romantic relationship, I want fast feedback loops. I want to be able to know that within the first couple of weeks. Right. But that's sometimes what happens. Bankrupt. Right? Yeah. Exactly. Right.
Okay. So this is actually a perfect segment to the next question. But as I said, to the listeners know, this is all organic. So it's not like we rehearsed this, but I'm just thinking about the work that you do. The issue, though, with the trust is, this is the caveat, then I'll go to my question. Mm-hmm. The higher trust in an organization, the quicker people will present to you an issue. Like there's an issue, like somebody's screwing up, they'll come to you right away. But when it's a low trust organization, there's more of a lag time between when the situation happens and when it comes to light. And many times it comes to light by somebody else outside the organization, like the front page of the New York Times, and it's usually not pretty, right? Or our best friend's friend tells us that somebody's fooling around on us. So with that understanding, right, low trust organization, lag time between feedback, and high trust organization happens right away. So explain how that can help us understand the concept of understanding why good people make and repeat bad decisions. I'm just hearing it connected, sure. Unless I'm just complicating things.
So the simple answer to that question is, good people make bad decisions, not because they are bad people, not because they are ignorant, but they have bad assumptions. Okay. Does it make sense? So good people make bad decisions for good reasons. What are the good reasons? Mostly, it's because they have some bad assumption, some limiting assumption or belief.
For example,
that it's better to not trust. That's a bad assumption. It will have an impact on the culture that you create. So as a leader, you basically have to flip that around. If you want to create a culture where there's trust, you have to show trust to others, right? You have to give them fast feedback about what's actually happening in the financial status of the company. We had a couple of years back, I was sitting down brainstorming with a CEO of a very large company, and he said one of the biggest frustrations he's got is, why do people not speak up when they made a mistake, right? And I said, why do you think? Because they're scared.
Exactly. Because of you.
Yeah. So he said, how do I address that?
Did he ask what were they afraid of, or he knew what you were talking about?
No, he immediately knew. I mean, it's, in a corporate environment, and it's interesting, right? People are more scared of errors of commission, doing something that they shouldn't, than errors of omission. right? Not doing
Which is
something
why
that we
low
should.
trust organizations have
Right.
little innovation.
So I said to him, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have a one-day workshop, and you're going to send out an invite to say that we're launching a competition. We are launching a competition to see who can claim that they've made the biggest mistake that's cost the company the most money. And he said, but nobody will apply for the competition. I said, but you have to say that you're going to be competing as well, and you suspect that your mistake was 10 times worse than anybody else's mistake. But here's why you're launching the competition, is we have to learn from experience. So every mistake that's shared, we're going to try to understand what was the reason why that mistake was made, what was that good reason, which essentially was the bad assumption at the time, and how can we make sure that we never make this mistake again. And we'll publish this as a booklet of case studies. And this will be the start of a journey where we are encouraging people to share immediately the mistake that they've made, why, what they've learned from it. And that's the thing that gets you off the hook.
Right. Permission to fail. Permission to fail.
Right. We don't want to, we don't want to learn fast from failures, right? We just want to learn fast, right? So the sooner we learn from it, the better. And we had this day, and it was fantastic. I mean, it was so interesting because he stood up and he said, I had decided to outsource this thing. I had outsourced it to a competitor. There was a massive burn down in one of their factories. So suddenly we were completely dependent on them to supply. Because of a short supply, the price doubled. It wiped out all of our profits. And this is how much it cost us, hundreds of millions of dollars. So I'm quite confident that during the whole day, nobody will share a bigger mistake.
And by the way, was that true? That was a true story.
Absolutely okay. True story, right? And it was fantastic because it was like this cloud that lifted off people's, and everybody had that suddenly I can tell them, right? And we encourage them to share everything, including, by the way, one of the biggest reasons for bad decisions is, again, not because of bad people or ignorant people, but because of bad measurements, right? Show me how you measure me, and I will show you how I behave. If you measure me on the wrong thing, don't be surprised at my behavior. So we ask the same question to people. Are there situations where you are taking an action that you know is bad for the system, but you feel compelled because of the way that you measured, like quarterly targets?
It happens all the time because I work corporate and entrepreneur, right. And the whole quarterly pressure is out of control. It is so bad.
So I think that's a short answer to your question. Is trust is really important.
I want to hear 1,000%. Right. That's where the culture permeates from. So what were the, if you can, the tangibles that changed in that company when that exercise was done?
So the first thing that was that we wanted to measure the lag between the mistake being made and that mistake being announced.
Okay, what we just talked about. Okay.
Right. And that dropped dramatically. Essentially, what we said is that the only protection you have against being held accountable for a bad decision is immediately sharing that bad decision. As soon as you get evidence that the consequences was bad, share it. And that's important because a bad decision and a bad outcome is not the same thing. You could have a good decision that have a bad outcome.
Right.
And you could have a bad decision that have a good outcome. Like, for example, I can decide that even though I've had 3 glasses of wine, I feel okay to drive home, right? And I get home and I'm safe. Was it a good decision? No, it was a terrible decision. You could have killed somebody and destroyed their life and your life, right? So that's the other thing that we teach in the organization is be careful. Good and bad decision doesn't mean good or bad outcome. You can have a good decision that resulted in a bad outcome simply because of probabilities, right? Is that in most cases, that decision would have resulted in a good outcome, but sometimes it would result in a bad outcome. We launched a new product. We were fully expected that sales went up. It didn't go up. Now we want to know why. So the sooner I declare the bad outcome, the sooner I can start analyzing to see what was the bad assumption that we made.
Okay, so let's go to, I think you're mature enough to remember years ago when Coke launched that disastrous new Coke product.
Yes, absolutely.
So like I'm in Stamford, Connecticut, and Sobeys, which is, oh no, that was Pepsi. But so here you have a company, a lot of smart people, they spent a lot of money on marketing dollars. And it was an absolute unmitigated flop. Right. So I assume that was from what, bad assumptions, or they just researched, so right? This happens on all different scales. So how does that happen in an organization?
So what we know from the way that our mind works, as I mentioned, is we don't rationalize and then we decide. We decide and then we rationalize. So we make a decision and then we look for evidence to support the decision. Right. It's actually quite hard to disprove yourself. It takes effort, right? So what happened in that case is they decided that by changing the taste of Coke, they will be able to better compete with Pepsi because Pepsi was killing them in the blind tasting test, right? So they decided to come up with that. And what they did was they actually had focus groups that in hindsight, what it looks like is they were blind to the evidence that there was a significant amount of people that hated it. So because their belief was this is better, you now look at the focus group data and you look for evidence to support your conclusion. And in hindsight, okay, that was about if they did a focus group was saying, we don't know if this is better or not. That's the purpose of doing the experiment, right? Is to check if it's going to work or not work. So you have to make it falsifiable. That's one of the criteria for the scientific method, right? Anything that's science is you have to be able to do an experiment that can tell you if it didn't work, that your hypothesis is untrue. And I think the same is true for anything. We think that something will work, so we look for evidence. We think that we shouldn't trust somebody, so we look for evidence. So just being aware that we always have that bias, and when we're designing an experiment, we should design it in a way that we can test. My biggest conclusion is that we don't learn from experience. That's why we don't learn. That's why we often repeat mistakes.
Yeah.
Why is that? Well, we don't learn from experience. We learn from experiments. If I can repeat that, we do not learn from experience. We learn from experiments.
Okay, so tell us more about that.
An experiment is where the assumption is very explicit. Mm-hmm. And I have a way of validating or invalidating it, and I can get fast feedback. So imagine touching a hot stove plate. Why does it normally take only one case to learn? Because you get immediate feedback. But imagine if that hot stove plate burnt you a day later, or a week later, or a month later. Mm-hmm. And that's a challenge that people have in organization, is the lag between the action and the consequences are often quite significant.
Which is exactly why when they had, for years, they had stock performance and executive pay tied to the stock performance. But guess what? The ramifications for the bad decisions were 2 or 3 years later, but they took their money. Exactly.
So that's kind of the key thing here is whatever assumption you want to try out or test, you have to design an experiment where that assumption is very clear. So if it's about, we can trust these people. Okay, how do I design an experiment to know whether I can trust them, yes or no? How would a person behave that can be trusted versus cannot be trusted? And how can we get quick feedback about whether that's taking place? Because like I mentioned, as soon as you trust somebody, you start looking for evidence to trust them. Mm-hmm. If you decide not to trust them, you look for evidence not to trust them. So you want to say it's a good starting assumption to trust, but I have to do smart trust. I have to be explicit and make it foolproof. That to me is like the best way to operate is to create situations where people do not require trust. that there's only one way of doing things, and that's the right way of doing it.
Okay, so I'm going to push back, which is probably going to get me into so much trouble if you truly are a certifiable genius. But from what I remember from my science days and doctoral days, there really is no objective experiment, because the human, by definition, brings their subjective perception, right? It's the whole conversation about AI, right? You still have to create it. There's still, hate to use the term today because it's all over the place, but there's inherent bias that gets put into the formula, if you will, of the person creating the whatever it is, right? So if there's an experiment, and based upon my life experience and my perception of what I think is the truth, it might be different than yours for many reasons. I'm a woman, you're a man. I'm an American. Where are you from?
South Africa originally.
You're from South Africa, right? Two different cultures, two different genders. I bet you we have had two different life experience up until even right now. So that being said, with the limitation of humans not being able to be completely objective, which I think is the beauty of human nature, but how do you account for that? And maybe I'm just too simple to understand that.
No, I think it's a great point. It's one of the things that you realize when you start studying science is the first thing that they drill into your mind is that you can never prove yourself right, but you can prove yourself wrong, right? You can go and do observations of swans, and you do 1,000 observations, and you come back and you say, every time I've looked for swans, they were always white. At
Swans,
what point,
you're saying, right?
Yeah, swans. Like at what point can I say that all swans are white? Because the last thousands observations were all white swans. It only takes one observation of a black swan to crush that hypothesis, right?
Right.
So when you're thinking about doing an experiment to say, by doing this, we think that customers will buy more. Or by doing this, we think that employees will become more productive or happier in their workplace. Is to say, can I design an experiment that can help me at least to the order of magnitude? Because many of these things I can't measure precisely, right?
No absolutes, right.
Right. But I can normally measure at least 3 levels. Has it made it better or much better? Has it made it
Plus
worse?
or minus, what do they call it? Significant?
Statistically significant. Right? It's like have a kind of control limit to say, listen, within this portion, it's noise. I don't know. If I interview you today, I say, Dr. Parry, this we made this change a month ago. Do you feel happier today? And then on Monday you tell me happy. On Tuesday you tell me not so happy. It's noise. So I have to decide a way that, and often it's about asking the person, like, what would you look for if we've made this change for you to know whether you feel more trusting in this company, where you feel more productive? What are your criteria? How will you know whether we're getting much better, much better, worse, or much worse? And then not a big change. And it's often just sitting down with them to say, how are we going to measure whether this has actually resulted in an improvement?
But if you have a huge company, you can ask can you ask every individual for how they would measure success?
It could be, there was I don't know if you've read the book, The Progress Principle.
No.
That's a really good example of this type of experiment. Basically what happened is they tried to
Progress Principle, who's the author?
Yeah.
Might as well give you a shout out.
Yeah. They tried to understand what creates happiness in an organization, what makes people feel unhappy and happy. And they came up, they asked the people through interviews, they asked their managers, and what they found out was that they contained the same list, but that wasn't the thing that made them happy, because if they tried to implement that, it didn't measurably improve happiness. So what they asked people to do was just 2 things. They said, on a daily basis in your diary, we want you to make a face, happy face, sad face, neutral face, about how you feel. And secondly, we want you to record any event that happened that day. That's it. And just do that for 30 days. And what they then put the data together, found some interesting correlations, and found out that what is key to happiness is that people feel they are making progress towards an important goal.
Of the company or of their career?
For them personally and for the company.
Both.
For both.
Right, so that their work has meaning, their work has purpose.
Right. But the idea of progress was important. It wasn't so much about an absolute number. It's what does that absolute number relate to from what it was yesterday and the day before? Are we going up, down, or staying about the same? And whenever we're going up, then it makes me happier. But there was a second requirement, was that in the cases where my performance has deteriorated, that they expect the leadership team not to hold them accountable for it, but to ask, how can we help?
What's going on?
Right? And of course, once you've gotten the help and you still don't perform because of your own, okay, then it's absolutely fair to be held accountable. But it turns out that those two were the big things, is getting everybody to think about your performance that's required. So how do you make sure you don't become the constraint, right? That your department always have enough resources. Like, what are you going to be measuring? Is it the turnaround time of the applications that come in, or the amount of stuff that you can do? So we have this measurement that I developed. It's called QT over OE.
Q, the letter QT?
Yeah, QT over OE, and it stands for quality, throughput over operating expenses. And this is the best and simplest way of measuring productivity. So if you think about what they represent, so Q is the quality of your work, and that's dictated by your customers. So you ask them, how are they going to measure, whether it's internal or external, how will they measure your quality of work? The second thing is throughput, is how much work have you done?
What is that word? Stupid is?
Throughput. So the output, so how many things have you done? So I have my throughput.
I must have failed my English SATs. I don't think I know that word.
My accent is probably pretty bad. So throughput or output. So how many invoices that you complete last month? How many project tasks that you complete? How many tons that you produce? How many clients that you call? That's the throughput component, the output of your process, right? And then below the line is the operating expenses, all the costs that you've incurred to generate quality throughput. And essentially it's now a ratio. And what's important is not the absolute number. What's important is what's happening with that number over time. Mm-hmm. So throughput or output is limited by the amount of demand that you have for your department's service, right? Mm-hmm. So the upper limit is I'm meeting all the demand. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That becomes my upper limit of it. So if you're not meeting all your demand, guess what your first focus area should be to improve your productivity, is to find a way of getting capacity to meet all the demand. Mm-hmm. Once you meet all the demand, then you have to meet it according to the quality criteria of your customer. That's the second leverage point for improving your productivity, is increasing the quality. But again, there's an upper limit, which is it's good enough.
Right.
And then so that top line is the effectiveness component, quality throughput, quality output. Below the line is the efficiency component. Mm-hmm. What is the total cost for you to provide that? Mm-hmm. And what you can see is, if I make a trade-off, if I go and reduce operating expenses, but it hurts either my quality or my throughput, my output, it will immediately hurt my productivity. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I'm constantly looking for changes that I can make that gives me a big upside, right? It increases my quality and throughput more than what it increases my cost. Then I'm being productive. And you can take any initiative in a company, whether it's an initiative to improve the trust or to improve other areas of the business, but that should be the ultimate metric that says, if this initiative was good for the organization, I should see a measurable improvement. I should see measurable progress in quality throughput over OPEX, QT over OE. It contains that ratio. It prevents people from local optimizing. If I measure these three things in isolation, I can spend a lot of money on quality, but it doesn't actually help because my throughput didn't go up. Or I can cut resources and I'm not aware of what the downside of that is. Suddenly I can't meet my demand.
Right. Okay. So let's just shift gears for a moment. So who is Dr. Alan Barnard and how did you get here? Who are you? Tell us a little bit about the man that you are, how you got here.
So I was just very curious always about what makes certain people become successful, despite
what drove that curiosity?
So I grew up in South Africa. We didn't have much resources, and my grandfather always encouraged me to study successful people. And that made me curious. As soon as you think they became successful because they had better starting conditions than you, right? They were clever.
That's an assumption. Assumption.
Of course. And then what you find out is, as you're reading this, you find out that most of the most successful people in the world often faced quite bad limiting conditions.
Hunger. They were hungry for knowledge.
Right.
So who was one of the first people that you studied that you were like, aha?
Well, in our own family, a distant uncle of mine was Dr. Christian Barnard. He was the doctor that did the first heart transplant.
Right.
Right. And if you looked at that and you say, like, would anybody have put money that somebody from South Africa that grew up very poor, that had very limiting, conditions in the hospitals, etc., would they be the first one to do a heart transplant? Because there was a race going on all around the world. Some of the leading academic institutions in the US and Russia and everywhere else was trying. And that to me was curious, like, how was it? And it turns out it's got very little to do with your starting conditions, much more to do with your starting assumptions.
All right. So wait, I do want to hear about him. So there's an expression a friend and I use all the time. It's like the guy was born on third base, but he acts like he hit a triple. Right. So that huge advantage. And guess what? They never leave third base.
Right.
So what was the condition from your distant cousin?
Well, I realized that, and this was shortly after I read this famous quote by Henry Ford, where he said, whether you believe something
you can or you
not,
don't, you're right.
You're right. Whether you can believe you can or can't, you're right.
Right.
And I thought, well, could that be the starting assumption that really matters? If I believe I'm not a good public speaker, I won't even try.
Right. Was Elon Musk originally from South Africa?
Yes, he was also.
Another one, right.
And the same thing, right? You can go and look at and saying, okay, his parents are pretty impressive, but nothing out of the ordinary. And yet this kid grew up with this compulsion that not only he can do something, but he has to do something. Right.
Well,
and I think
that has to. It's the drive. That's the drive.
I think it's a combination of those two things that I learned early on. It's not just that you believe you can, but you believe you must.
Is it driven from a sense of to whom much is given, much is expected, meaning brain power, meaning you must because this is your purpose in life, or the world needs this? Like, I mean this sincerely. Like what we just create. Okay, this is a classic American. I said we. Maybe it's not American, but the COVID vaccine, right? I think there was a template there already, but we got through a lot of the bureaucracy, but we created a vaccine in 4 months or refined it. There was a sense of we had to. When we saved lives. I'll even go so far as to say during World War II, America and the Allies saved the world from fascism. We had to defeat because
necessity. There's that quote that says, necessity is the mother of invention.
Yeah.
So sometimes I think it is like that, but it often is not that. It's often this curiosity about when I work with young people and they say, how do I get to what's my life goal? What's my purpose? I ask them, what bothers you? Like like what really bothers you? If it's about, animal abuse or woman abuse or discrimination or the fact that we're wasting scarce resources, it bothers you because you feel responsible, right? That you should be doing something. Else it wouldn't bother you. Else you would just treat it as, life is, quite sad. I mean, a lot of bad things happening. It only bothers you if you feel like you have to do something about it. And I think that's a good way of starting off, is that often these great breakthroughs come from somebody that not only believe they can do something about it, but they must do something about it because they feel responsible. And that can generate amazing insights.
So it is a curiosity too, but I know we have to go, which I could talk to you forever. Like I'd love round two, but I think the research shows that women are becoming entrepreneurs at like double the rate of men. And many times it's because women see a need as part of their life and they feel there's a need to do something like, I don't know, Mothers Against Drunk Driving from years ago.
But women also have a unique challenge from a decision-making perspective. One of my PhD students is working on this at the moment. She was curious about this inconsistency between, over many, many years, why so few patents are registered by women, why so few of the top positions are occupied by women. Mm-hmm. And the question is can it be fully explained by discrimination and other things, or is there something else at work? And what she's testing as an hypothesis is that women...
Well, I like the way you're hedging that, because I'm trying to figure out if I'm going to pounce on you or not.
Sure. So what she's testing at the moment is that research shows that women make many, many more decisions than men every single day. Mm-hmm. And we also are aware of another factor, which is called decision fatigue. So the more decisions you make, the more fatigue you get, and the more you basically are defaulting to a decision that is very low risk to you. So a very simple thing is how much time and cognitive capacity women think about and use in the morning to decide what to wear compared to men. And
be careful, you're losing me. Be careful, you're losing me. You're right.
Right, but when you look at, okay, so how do you overcome that, right? Even men do that, right? So it's Steve Jobs, like, I have a standard outfit, right? Because I want to save this cognitive capacity and my willingness to tolerate the risk for where it matters. So the more I can reduce those trivial decisions, the more I'm releasing capacity. So that's kind of the area that she's explored. Obviously, it's a very complex issue, a very, very sensitive issue. But I think that the basic assumption kind of can provide some kind of explanation to say that for women to take risks, it's much harder than for men. And part of that is not just our biology and genes, but part of it is because women tend to make many, many more decisions than men. So you have to be even more careful about what are the things that you actually apply your thinking to versus not.
I totally get. Feel free to put that woman in touch with me. I would love to have a conversation with her. I think that's true. Like, there's the joke: a man says, "I'm going to go to bed at night." He gets up and he goes to bed. A woman says she's going to go to bed at night. She gets up. She takes the dishes out of the dishwasher. She takes the clothes out of the dryer. She realizes, I'm going to pack the lunch, right? It is part of the decision fatigue. Having said that, and I know you're talking about patents, but there is, and I'm all for personal responsibility. I will not fall on the sword of woe is me, I'm a woman. I don't agree with that. Having said that, the research also shows that venture capital is not given to women. There is also a societal bias against women taking risks, not only coming from themselves, but from the people that will allow them to take a risk for many, many different reasons, right? So I do think it's complicated, but I would dare say that women don't have as many brilliant ideas. They just might not be patented, right? In an organization, a woman makes a suggestion, nobody listens. A guy says the same exact thing, not 3 seconds later, and he's a genius. And there's a lot of stuff, but I think.
No. I'll leave you with this kind of quote. That to me is the exciting part of it, because there's this principle in science that says one case is a proof, right? Mm-hmm. If I'm a person and I think, listen, my starting conditions is limiting me from achieving any meaningful goals in life, all I have to do is to look for just one case of somebody that was in the same position as I am, that managed to achieve it. That's all I need. One case, right? I don't need hundreds. I just need one case to show me that it's possible. And then what we encourage people to do is this question of mine is, how do you find and discover a limiting assumption? And to me, the most limiting assumption is if we start believing that it's impossible, that something meaningful is impossible. And I simply challenge them to ask themselves, it's impossible unless.
Or until?
No, it's impossible unless, because what that does is it trips up the brain, it reboots the brain to start focusing on the conditions that could make the impossible possible. So it's a great disruptive question. It gets people out of that stuck mode. It says, you have a goal that's so ambitious that you think it's impossible. It's impossible unless, and let them write the conditions. That becomes your plan. That becomes the conditions where the impossible becomes possible.
And I love that, because that brings us full circle, because that identifies the constraints.
Right. That is the bottleneck is always at the top of the bottle. I'll leave your listeners with that, right?
I love
it's
that.
Always
I love it.
some limiting assumption or belief. And it's just about, how do I discover them? How do I challenge them? How do I design an experiment to go and check if there may be a better way?
All right. So I know you have to run, but I have to ask you, I usually have two, but I'll cut it down to one. What's the last book you reread and why?
I loved Thinking Fast and Slow by Dr. Daniel Kahneman, right, where he talks about the two systems of thinking. System one, which is our fast and automatic mode, and then system two, which is slow and more deliberate mode. And what he talks about specifically in there is system one is prone to errors. We are making very predictable mistakes when we use our gut feeling, when we use our instinct and intuition. And that's why I always cringe when coaches and mentors tell people, when it comes to decision making, just count down from 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, decide. No. If it's a bloody important decision, take the time and actually slow down your thinking, look at it from all sides, look at it from all perspectives, try to come up with as many options as you can, and pick those options that have a big upside if it works and a small downside if it doesn't. And stay the hell away from those options that have a small upside if it works and a big downside if it doesn't. Yeah. So that to me I think that's a really simple framework of thinking about decision making.
Great. So how can people find out more about you? Where would you like them?
My personal website is dralanbarnard.com.
BARNARD. BARNARD. Okay.
Yeah, and Alan is ALAN. So dralanbarnard.com, and then our website for all of our apps, which are all the decision support apps, is just harmonyapps.com.
We didn't get to that, so we'll have that in round 2.
Great.
harmonyapps.com. Okay. Right. Thank you so much. This was... I talk about not feeling like the smartest person in the room, like, wow. And that concludes today's podcast episode of The Trust Doctor, Restoring Trust and Enriching Significant Relationships. And as I told you, Dr. Barnard did not disappoint. He took us for a ride. So make sure you like, comment, share, and subscribe to this podcast. Until next time, be well.
Once again, we've concluded another great episode of The Trust Doctor with Dr. Patty Ann. Tune in next week for more insights and advice on how you can create, nurture, and sustain healthy relationships. To find out more about the podcast, visit drpattyann.com/podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, review, and share. Until next time.